Hi there, everyone. I hope that you are having a wonderful day. I'm taking a little break from my traditional history videos that draw their content from the textbooks. I am taking this break to introduce and discuss something that is usually only barely mentioned in our U.S. history textbooks. This video is going to look at the Japanese Americans that fought for a country that hated them during World War II. I will use primary sources to explain why they did this. I do this to honor the most decorated military unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Okay, let's go for broke. On December 7, 1941, 0 pilots from the Empire of Japan attacked the United States Naval Force at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. American feelings of animosity against Japan that stemmed from its aggressive actions in China and Russia after World War I were compounded with shock and dismay. A level of fear and mistrust gripped the nation at a level not seen prior. White Americans hated the Japanese, whether they were Issei, first-generation immigrant Japanese, or their Nisei children, who were American-born citizens. They considered both the Issei and the Nisei possible spies and saboteurs. For this reason, the United States government forcibly relocated Japanese living on the mainland into internment camps far away from any possible targets of their sabotage. This caused many families to lose their homes and businesses. Despite this hate and prejudice, Japanese American men from the mainland and from Hawaii proudly and readily volunteered to fight in World War II. The warrior code of Bushido, loyalty and honor till death, drove the Nisei to fight not for Japan, but for America. The question must be asked, why did Nisei soldiers fight for a country that hated them? While there has been much conversation about the Nisei soldiers' unparalleled success, the motives that drove these men have been often overlooked. My argument intends to show that the Nisei fought for the Americans that hated them because America hated them. They looked to improve the situation for their next generations by sacrificing themselves in order to show their loyalty to America. Japanese American soldiers in World War II fought against the Axis powers in Europe and the Pacific in order to fight the fear and racism against them in America. Gathering personal reflections about the war has been a difficult experience for historians. Issei parents taught the importance of modesty and frowned on drawing attention to self-accomplishment. The Nisei soldiers' accomplishments as a group have been well documented using military records, but individual accounts have been hard to come by. As relations have changed between them and the Americans who discriminated against them, more and more Nisei soldiers have had their accounts published in writing or recorded orally. This argument tries to tie these accounts together, focusing not on their achievements, but on their motivations. It will try to show how their culture, feared by many Americans, actually manifested loyalty and duty towards America. Culture was very important to the Japanese, and the Issei demanded their children be exposed to it. While the Issei heavily influenced their Nisei children, generational differences could not be avoided. Issei parents always had plans to return to Japan. For this reason, they held firmly to old Japanese customs and traditions. This essentially transformed their communities into little Japans. Their Nisei children began to question why they were not embracing Americanism. This created a very visible generation gap. Many Nisei now believe that this is partly the reason that Japanese were not warmly accepted by the American population. Festivals were one of the primary methods that the Issei used to maintain the Japanese culture. Los Angeles festivals started off as an expression of ancient customs, but the situation in Asia between Japan and China became extremely volatile. This aggression in Asia caused another rift to develop between the Issei and the Nisei. Issei supported Japan's imperialism, while the Nisei thought their support would be contradictory to Americanization. As tensions became even more intense, the Nisei seized control of the festival's organization. In their effort to integrate into American society and show their American loyalty, the Nisei changed the festivals by adding a beauty pageant, a parade, and other American traditions to their Japanese dance and martial arts. This is not to say that the Issei were anti-American. Japanese culture was very spiritual. Nisei children often attended Buddhist ministries. There, the Issei ministers instilled their Nisei students with the idea of the 4 On, or gratitudes, which were said to provide safety and protection. The second one was gratitude to the country. The Issei emphasized that the Nisei were Americans, and to show that gratitude, they were to be good, loyal Americans. The Issei demanded duty and honor to America from their Nisei children. After rushing home following the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Nisei soldier in Hawaii, Seiso Kamishita, found his parents standing outside holding hands. They told him that they understood that he was Japanese American and that they were Japanese. They understood that Japan and America were now enemies, and that if he felt like it was his duty as an American soldier to shoot them, they would be proud. This duty to America was the reason that there was no sympathy or support from the Nisei for Japan after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. On the contrary, they felt anger and resentment. Daniel K. Inouye, who would eventually volunteer and serve in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, RCT, felt an immense amount of shock followed by anger that the Japanese would intrude on his own island. Inouye, as a member of the 442nd, would lose his arm in battle and eventually become a U.S. Senator for Hawaii. For Don Seki, the identity of the attacker was irrelevant. An enemy attacked his island, and he wanted war. The fact that it was Japan did not ease his feelings. Rather, it made him more disgusted. Conrad Tsukayama also shared his anger. He said, "My anger was based on betrayal, the deepest hurt that can be inflicted. The deep-rooted respect and admiration for the Japanese instilled in us from childhood was shattered. They were mercilessly killing their own immigrant citizens." This duty to America that the Nisei felt ran contrary to what the white Americans expected of the Japanese Americans. Many Americans figured that the Japanese Americans were enthusiastic about the attack. The consequences of this feeling were prejudice and racism. Newspaper articles on the West Coast filled their articles with ethnofallisms, the language of prejudice towards the Americans of Japanese descent. Articles from the Los Angeles Times were filled with names that had racially negative connotations. The articles referred to Americans of Japanese descent as Japs and called them threats, saboteurs, and possible fifth colonists. Artists utilized the facial structure of the Japanese and painted them as demonic and evil in ads and magazine covers. Since the tone of the mass media often mirrors its audience, it can be shown that the general public also had these fears and prejudices. While the United States also declared war with Germany and Italy, Americans did not show the same degree of fear and hatred toward German and Italian Americans. As Roger Daniels points out in Concentration Camps USA, Americans saw racial guilt differently when comparing Japanese to German and Italian Americans. The latter two were judged individually because they had been well integrated into the American melting pot for quite a long time. On the contrary, there was still a fear of the Asian immigrant groups, shown by the rules prohibiting them from owning property and marrying whites. Americans judged the relatively new Japanese Americans guilty as a whole race. The United States government acted accordingly to this fear and suspicion as well. According to the National Japanese American Historical Society, when the war with Japan began, there were approximately 5,000 Japanese Americans in the U.S. Armed Forces. Except for in Hawaii, most were discharged, classified as enemy aliens, even though they were citizens of the United States. Hawaiian forces stayed in Hawaii guarding the beaches and coastline from any possible invasion by Japan. On May 28, 1942, all Japanese American soldiers were shipped out of Hawaii during the darkness of the night. This was in anticipation of another attack by Japan as its naval forces were approaching Midway. These men eventually ended up in Mississippi for combat training and were renamed the 100th Battalion, separate. Excusing a few officers, this was the first combat unit in U.S. history to be composed of entirely Japanese Americans. Once this was done, the United States stopped accepting new Nisei volunteers for war service. Civilians on the mainland also faced relocation. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order gave the military broad power to forcibly relocate any and all Japanese to internment areas. Whole Japanese families were given notice to leave everything behind and were moved to the American South, away from any possible interaction with the Japanese enemy. This internment caused another division between the Issei and the Nisei to emerge. Nisei, like Yoshisuke Kunitomi, who would eventually serve for the military intelligence service, were shocked that a country that lived by the Bill of Rights would evacuate its own citizens. His parents' reactions, on the other hand, were of shikata ganai, which meant it cannot be helped. Many of the Issei shared this helpless feeling, while their Nisei children considered this a naive way to look at the situation. The Nisei wanted to be considered American and to enjoy the rights of Americans. In order to do this, they had to demonstrate their love for America. The Nisei felt they had a desperate need to prove to others in their beloved country that although the enemy looked very much like them, their loyalty was to America, and they were willing to give their lives to prove that loyalty so that not only their families but others could have a better life. They soon got their chance to do that. In January of 1943, the War Department announced plans to create a segregated Japanese unit for combat action in Europe. It was made up of Nisei volunteers from both Hawaii and from the internment camps on the mainland. The Selective Service issued questionnaires to the Nisei with questions that asked their willingness to serve in the U.S. Army and to repudiate their allegiance to Japan. If they answered yes to these questions, they were eligible to volunteer or to be drafted. No-no boys, as they came to be called, answered no to both of those questions and stayed in the camps. The no-no boys were not a majority, nor did they represent any dominant attitude. Most of the no-no boys were kibai, which means that they were American-born but raised in Japan. They answered no because they wished to return to Japan. Some critics argue that many of the Nisei volunteered in order to escape the brutal life of the internment camp and the racism surrounding it. In reality, according to Jason Morgan Ward, while racism existed in the internment camps in the South, it was a much milder form that existed in California and the western United States. Residents of Arkansas, which hosted 2 internment camps, were fearful that when the Japanese interns were released, they would want to stay. The emergence of this new race was not seen as a threat to the white Americans' safety, rather a threat to their segregated society. The South was still a segregated society. In many situations, but definitely not all, the Japanese Americans were allowed on the white side of the racial color line. But caution was taken so that a wedge would not form in their segregated society that the black population could squeeze into. While the Japanese Americans rejected the rules of this segregation, life in the camp was not so bad that it would compel a person to risk his life to escape. For the most part, the Nisei were eager to fight for America. This enthusiasm did not make the formation of the 442nd RCT smooth. The Hawaiians and the mainlanders were not similar people and did not understand each other. Hawaiians saw the mainlanders as uptight, while the mainlanders saw Hawaiians as loose and petty. This rift almost caused the unit to be disbanded before it ever saw any action. In a last-ditch effort, the commanding officer of the unit took them all to an internment camp. The Hawaiians, who had not been forced to relocate because they were a majority in Hawaii, gained an understanding of the suffering that the mainlanders went through. From this, a brotherhood formed. The separation between them disappeared. Both groups were Nisei. Both groups were Americans of Japanese ancestry. Many say that this is when the 442nd was truly formed. This was a brotherhood of minorities. The 442nd RCT, which would later have the 100th Battalion incorporated into it, sought to fight for acceptance into the American community. They sought equality as Americans. They lived by their code of duty, honor, and gratitude to their country of America. Colonel Young Kim of the 442nd drove his men to do well in combat. He understood that the Japanese had a stigma attached to its people, whether Japanese or American of Japanese descent. He knew how bad things were for his people, and that unless they did well on the battlefield for America, things would be very bad. According to Colonel Kim, we had to do well in combat in order to rectify all these conditions. And particularly, if the stigma that the Japanese Americans were living under was to be removed, then we had to do well in combat. And everybody recognized the officers and even the NCOs. I didn't get a chance to talk to the soldiers, but they all recognized that unless we did well, things were going to be terrible. By doing well, it meant that we had to do well, make a good record, but we had to shed blood, and that some and not many of us were never going to return. But that was a price we had to pay." End quote. Kim knew that the Japanese American community did not have the economic means to get out of its situation, so the 442nd had to have a good record in battle in order to help achieve the political means to help. He knew that his people had to do this for the next generations of Japanese Americans, even if it meant not coming home. Officers did not hold these feelings exclusively. Conrad Tsukayama felt that it was his duty to fight in order to separate the Japanese Americans from the people of the Empire of Japan. He felt that white Americans, because of the fear and panic after Pearl Harbor, could not tell the difference between Americans of Japanese ancestry and the Japanese Zero pilots that attacked their naval force in Hawaii. As a minority, he understood the value that fighting would bring to his people. He thought that fighting for America would show that he was a true American, not to be singled out. He said, "In a society in which all minorities struggled to gain acceptance, we were determined to prove to the world that we were indeed loyal Americans." End quote. The Nisei were willing to shed blood, even if it cost them their lives, to show their loyalty and gain acceptance. Though the Nisei soldiers disagreed with their parents' attitude of shikataganai, they did respect where their desire to serve America came from. Their values of duty and honor that pushed them to risk their lives in battle for a country that hated them had come from their helpless parents. Even as the soldiers fought against Japan, the Japanese cultural values instilled in them, often unobtrusively by their parents, influenced their thoughts and actions in the battlefield and in their pursuit of equality and a place of responsibility and respect among their fellow Americans. The Issei emphasized duty and honor to America from their Nisei children. The Nisei soldiers did win the respect of the United States government. The 442nd RCT was so successful that the drafting of Japanese Americans was reinstated in January 1944. The draft pulled from the Nisei in detention camps and was used to refill the ranks of the 442nd. The Nisei units also received many awards. For its size and length of service, the 442nd RCT, including the 100th Infantry Battalion, became the most decorated military unit in the history of the United States. These decorations included 9,486 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, and an astonishing 8 Presidential Unit citations. The approximately 4,000 men who started in the 442nd had to be replaced virtually 3.5 times. A full listing of the medals awarded can be found at the end of this video. Beyond the actual awards, the Nisei units won the respect of the American military commanders. According to Major General Willoughby, General MacArthur's intelligence chief, the Nisei saved countless lives and shortened the war by 2 years. End quote. General MacArthur also admired the work of the Japanese American units. He said, "Never in military history did an army know as much about the enemy prior to the actual engagement." This statement referred to the often overlooked military intelligence service that consisted of Nisei soldiers. The praise from the military and government about the Nisei in Europe and the Pacific ran contrary to the wartime hysteria that was taking place in the United States. The assumptions that the Japanese Americans on the mainland were threats were never validated. None of the unfounded newspaper stories of suspected acts of treason or sabotage were ever proven of anything other than being downright silly. In fact, many Japanese Americans, including Conrad Tsukayama, Don Seki, and future Hawaiian Senator Daniel K. Inouye, were angry at Japan, not allied with them, disgusted that they would attack their own immigrant people. Nisei soldiers from Hawaii, which became the 100th Battalion, separate, were later joined by Nisei volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland in the 442nd RCT. These Nisei soldiers lived the Bushido code, duty and honor taught to them by their Issei parents. They lived it in the American way. They fought for their land, they fought for their honor, and they fought to prove their American spirit. They fought against fear and racism against their people. As Colonel Kim stated, they fought to prevent a terrible situation for their later generations. They fought for a country that hated them because they loved that country. The battle to prove their American loyalty was not an immediate victory. The situation for the Japanese Americans on most of the mainland improved because of the favorable attention that the 442nd was getting, including articles in the New York Times calling them one of the great units of World War II. On the other hand, the situation in California remained hostile. A letter from Joseph Itagaki to Charles Hemingway explains, "The general feeling toward those of Japanese ancestry has improved tremendously, especially since the exploits of the 442nd Combat Team have received such widespread and favorable attention." On the other hand, as you point out, the feeling is still strong on the West Coast, specifically the state of California. The problem then, it seems to me, is to win over the Californians. And that, from their long history of race bigotry and prejudice, will be a difficult nut to crack." End quote. In the spring of 1945, Japanese Americans began to leave the internment camps. They did not all come home to cheers. In fact, white Americans in California stopped just short of lynching and murder to keep them from returning. With time, the actions of the Nisei soldiers would help heal the relationship between the Japanese Americans and the country that they call home. As President Truman said about the Nisei soldiers' accomplishments, "You fought not only the enemy, you fought prejudice and won." End quote. The superb performance by the Nisei troops helped lay the groundwork for Truman to desegregate the Army on July 28, 1948, with Executive Order 9981. It was his intention that from that point on, no soldier of any race would be limited in service or designated to serve in separate units in the United States military. And here are the decorations received by the 100th Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team. 21 Medals of Honor, 20 awarded on June 1, 2000. 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, including 19 Distinguished Service Crosses, which were upgraded to Medals of Honor in June 2000. 559 Silver Stars with 28 oak leaf clusters in lieu of second Silver Star. 1 Silver Star was upgraded to a Medal of Honor in June 2000. 8 Presidential Unit Citations, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, 22 Legion of Merit Medals, 15 Soldiers Medals, 4,000 Bronze Stars with 200 oak leaf clusters in lieu of second Bronze Star, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 12 French Croix de Guerre with 2 palms in lieu of a second award, 2 Italian Crosses for Military Valor, 2 Italian Medals for Military Valor and the decorations received by the Military Intelligence Service, 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, 1 Presidential Unit Citation awarded June 30, 2000, 5 Legion of Merit Medals. Amazing. Okay folks, thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. I hope you gained a little appreciation for the oft-overlooked Japanese Americans that fought a war to fight racism. I hope to see y'all soon on Nutshelled History.